When I wrote a particular article a while back for a local zine, part of the motivation was that, at the time, I didn't think I was really gonna do a video about it, so why not just write about it? And yet, here we are. This is not merely the story of a bewildering residence nestled in Portland's West Hills, nor is it merely the story of the eccentric chameleon of a man who brought it into existence, but a combination of the two and beyond. Fascinating story after fascinating story, a rise to power, a fall from grace, strange writings, odd beliefs, murder, art, the paranormal. This is the story of Charles Henry Pigott and the castle home he built above a city. The first video I ever posted as the vlogger who would become Steve the Amateur Historian on an old deleted channel was a simple 3-minute video as I wandered through Portland State University's campus while my wife was in class. The focus of the video was the view you get of a place known today as Piggott's Castle, on the hill overlooking downtown Portland. I knew little of its actual history back then, and practically nothing of the man who created it. But if you look at all of the remarkable homes built in Portland since its inception, Piggott's Castle is a one-of-a-kind, not just outside, but within. It is not merely a home of intrigue because of its charming appearance, but it is a place of intrigue due to the mind that conceived it. While Charles Henry Pigott is best known today for his castle home, his life consisted of so much more. And for how synonymous his name is with this castle, he actually lived there less than 2 years. The oddities of his life go back to day one, as, depending on the source, his date of birth fluctuates over several years. Findagrave.com says he was born in 1855, while Ancestry.com gets it closer by saying he was simply born in August 1851. Few sources discuss much of his life before 1877, which was the first year he came to Portland. But in his own words, from a 1914 article written about him, he stated he was born August 28, 1851, in Middlesex County, Ontario, in Canada. While his early years were spent north of the border, he came to America as a teenager in 1868. Here he found work in cattle herding and eventually in construction work in Chicago. It was here that he first learned the art of bricklaying, something that would come back into play later in his life. By the early 1870s, he started making his way out west, settling in Colorado for a short time. By his own account, he only came out to Colorado to have some fun, which abruptly led to him running out of money. Broke, he hitched it out further west, ultimately arriving in San Francisco by the end of 1873. Working various jobs, including more brickwork on a motel, he made some money, and by 1877 he hitched it north to Portland, a city where he'd heard the economy was struggling. This made sense in the aftermath of a fire in 1873 that nearly destroyed the whole city. With a massive portion of its waterfront gone, the ashes had barely cooled when the Panic of 1873 hit, leaving Portland struggling for years. But in Charles Piggott's case, it seems this is where he really started to understand his business sense. Shortly after arriving in the port city, one thing he noticed was the fact that produce sold a lot cheaper in Portland than in other places. So he bought up a boatload of produce and shipped it south to San Francisco, where it was sold on a markup. He said he made $1,500 in his first 3 months in Portland, a total that would be worth nearly $45,000 today. So, of course, he expanded on this, going fully into the produce business. But perhaps a bit too quick. He started stockpiling produce in storage to be shipped out later. But he waited too long, and most of his goods rotted before he could make a buck on them. He lost money quick and was broke again. Stuck trying to recover financially again, he did what he did in Colorado. He left. For a short time, he worked in railroad construction as well as surveying for roads. He got a little more money in his pocket and came back to Portland in 1879, and soon after went into the fuel business. In particular, the wood fuel business, which made sense as wood was a primary fuel source in America at that time. He established this business in the vicinity of 4th and Front Avenue, an intersection that no longer exists and a spot that no longer looks anything like it probably did back then. Piggott's company functioned on its own for roughly a decade before consolidating with another company and becoming the Pioneer Wood Company in 1889. During this time, working the fuel business in the 1880s, Pigott met a woman named Sarah Brown, who went by the name of Sadie, and the two were married on April 10th, 1883. They would have 4 children together, even though one of them, Lloyd, I have found no information on anywhere. But he existed, and you'll know why later. So I just want to pause a moment to acknowledge some curiosities about Lloyd, who appears to have been Charles Piggott's oldest child. Now, when I went through Ancestry.com information, I found nothing about Lloyd. It was as though he didn't exist. I didn't find him under Charles's name, under Sadie the mom's name. Found no information about him at all, but I was able to find information about the other children. However, I was able to find, amidst some Pigott ancestry stuff, a reference to Charles and Sadie having a child in March of 1885. Now, his other 3 children were born in 1887, 1889, and 1892, so this seems to be a clear reference to Lloyd. However, even when Sadie died in 1915, it references that she had 3 children. But it only references Gladys, Earl, and Charles Jr. There's no reference to Lloyd at all. So, I have this ancestry information here that says Charles and Sadie had a child in 1885. But like a small part of me is wondering, was perhaps Lloyd, did Charles have Lloyd with another woman? And that's why it doesn't show up in Sadie's obituary? I don't know, maybe Lloyd had passed away by 1915 before Sadie, so he wasn't referenced as one of the 3 children she was leaving behind. I don't know. This Lloyd Pigott, if that was his last name, I assume it was, is a little interesting. Little mysterious. While working in the fuel business, Pigott established his own, yes, brickyard, located on Sandy Boulevard on the east side. I dug and I dug, trying to find where exactly along Sandy this brickyard was located, with no luck. But with Sandy not starting until around 16th and Burnside at this time, and with East Portland barely extending beyond that point by the start of the 1890s, I would guess his brickyard was somewhere along Sandy, probably between 12th and 20th Avenues. But again, that is just a guess. This brickyard was also a massive success, pumping out 50,000 bricks a day. By 1891, Pigott found himself to be worth $90,000, or more than $3 million today. The man had disposable income. He also, even if it wasn't well known at the time, was a pretty strange guy. In the best way. In a written piece from many years later, a writer named Fred Lockley would describe him as a lawyer, a poet, a civil engineer, a philosopher, a bricklayer, a dreamer, a speculator, an author, a wood dealer, a hater of shams, a builder of air castles and of real castles, a thinker, and an odd genius. For our sake, by the time of 1891, that air castle part is the most pertinent. Charles Piggott was an avid reader, and at some point he picked up a book called Parley's History of the World by Samuel Griswold Goodrich, originally published in 1858. He would later say he saw a picture of a castle on a hill in Italy in this book, and it inspired him to get his own hill to build a castle upon. And that's how it started. While it's not a picture of the same castle, I did find it interesting that in one edition of this particular book, the image on the front cover is a castle on top of a hill. The process started with Piggott making a $2,500 purchase of land on a hill leading up from the base of Broadway as it ran south of downtown. While this hillside is lined with narrow roads and crazy expensive homes today, back in 1891 this was an undeveloped hillside, just trees and shrubs. That was probably part of the attraction beyond being a hill, the fact that Piggott could build a home there and have no one else around. He would then spend an additional $11,000 to build his dream castle home up on that hill. It may have been even more expensive, but Piggott had an angle. He wanted to build his home using bricks, and he owned a brickyard. It's worth mentioning here, and I did a whole video on this story alone, close to the same time that Piggott began his work on his castle in the sky, another prominent local Portlander, Philip Augustus Markham, was putting together an architectural project of his own. This would become the Markham Building, aka the Markham Grand, which was completed at 6th and Morrison in downtown in 1892, the same year Piggott completed his castle. Markham's building was substantially more expensive, seeing as it was in the heart of the city and, a multi-story modern office building. But something that frustrated Markham was the fact that local bricklayers had inflated their prices, perhaps knowing how wealthy he was. But instead of paying a little extra, Markham opened his own brickyard. It's unknown if Piggott's brickyard was one of the ones that was trying to price Markham out, but I get the feeling he probably was. But one thing we do know beyond all of this is that Charles Piggott made some good quality bricks. How do we know? Maybe because his castle is still standing more than 130 years later. Philip Markham's bricks, on the other hand, around 4 a.m. on November 21st, 1912, a portion of the east side of the Markham Grand collapsed. Only one person was in the building at the time, and Eva Aldrich, who was sleeping in the room directly above where the collapse started and managed to escape safely. It was determined the poor quality of the bricks used in the construction of the building was the main factor in this collapse, and the building was demolished shortly after. Philip Markham just happened to pass away months before this happened, evading a likely barrage of criticism from locals. When it came to Piggott's project, construction was not the hardest part. The hardest part was getting the project off the ground. Like I said earlier, this Piggott fellow was an interesting guy. Eccentric is the word most often used to describe his personality. You see, he didn't just want to build any castle. Sure, he wanted the classic elements of a castle, arches, alcoves, and, of course, a tower, but he wanted a home unlike any other. Not one room would be like another. No predictability. Some rooms were large, while others were almost annoyingly small. His plans were so bizarre to the layman that the initial architect he hired on for the project quit, telling Piggott to his face that he was insane. Back to square one, to a degree, Piggott said, "Screw it. I don't need an architect. I'll be my own architect." And with that, he processed forward on his own. He was later quoted to say on this matter, "I have always noticed that when you want to do anything different from what it has been done, there are lots of people willing to say you are crazy. Crazy or not, Pigott completed his dream castle in 1892. Now, while today this spot is affectionately called Piggott's Castle after its creator, the home did have an original name, and it was something else completely. While many locals called his castle Piggott's Folly due to how bizarre the architecture of the home was and how much money he put into it, his original name for it was the Gleal Castle. He came to this name by taking the first two letters of each of his three children's names and putting them together. Mind you, his fourth child was born in 1892, around the time the castle was already finished, and thus his name was just not part of the title. Strangely enough, this fourth child was the one they decided to name Charles Henry Pigott Jr. But his previous three children were named Lloyd, birth date unknown, William Earl, born 1887, and Gladys, born 1889. William would go by his middle name of Earl, so you take the first letters of Gladys, G-L, Earl, E-A, and Lloyd, L-L, and combine them together, you get Gleal. The tower of the home, as you might guess, was Piggott's favorite aspect of the castle. He called it his Sanctum Sanctorium, which translates to Holy of Holies, or Holy Place of Holy Places. This was the place he used to get away from the world and think and reflect on life, his beliefs, and his philosophy on life. And when he wasn't thinking, he was writing up there. While some of his written works show signs of being a fairly feminist individual, mind you, I'm saying that by 1890s standards, the flip to that is the fact that he forbade women access to his precious tower. I feel like that is Charles Piggott in a nutshell. I'm sure he put a lot of stock in his thoughts and perspectives on the world, but at the end of the day, I don't think he had a fantastic grasp on exactly what it was he believed. And so you get these conflicting perspectives. As much as Pigott loved his oddball home on his secluded hillside along with his Tower of Bliss, it didn't last long. The year after the construction was complete came the Panic of 1893, which wiped out just about every successful man about town, even though some of them recovered. Philip Markham made it through. William S. Ladd, one of the most prominent of early Portlanders, passed away right before the panic, and on the flip side, another prominent early Portlander, Frank Deacon, passed away in 1894, but it is believed the stress of the panic contributed to his death. Charles Piggott was another one that was nearly wiped out by the panic, going from a man with $90,000 to his name in 1891 to a man who barely had $900 in 1893. He had no choice but to let his castle in the sky go, and he'd never get it back. I've got time to kill. I'm thinking about going home, but I'm like, I got space left on my camera. I'm in the city, and I've been just like trying to figure out like what to do with my free time. And I just now remembered a kind of cool thing that I discovered literally like 2 days ago. And I got a little bit of a walk, but I'm pretty much going up the Broadway right up there, past PSU, across the bridge to where you just kind of start leaving downtown. I literally discovered this thing by chance. I was just going through Google Maps and this icon popped up at this spot, and I was like, ooh, this looks interesting. I'm not going to say because I won't spoil the surprise, but I clicked on it and I realized, oh, that's cool, because I've always wanted to go to Piggott's Castle. The main reason I've never tried walking there is because it's these roundabout, uphill streets. It would have taken me forever to get there on foot, no matter what direction I came in from. However, what I found by chance on Google Maps may actually help circumvent that little problem. According to my phone, we're getting really close to it, which pisses me off. I've literally walked right through this area before. I've taken pictures of this old cool apartment building. Walked right behind it. Ah, I see it.
Piggott'S castle is just right up here, somewhere. And it would take winding up and down these side roads. It would take me forever to get there, unless I was able to find a shortcut. And take a look at this. So I stumbled onto this by total accident, again on Google Maps. I just saw the icon, I was like, what's this? It's a little icon that said elevator stairs. Okay, so here we go. Here's where it starts. I have no clue how high these stairs are. Cool under them though. Hey, watch. Be smart. Don't be a criminal. Oh my god. This is insane. So what the heck am I doing right now? Oh my lord. At least I'm gonna go down from here. Oh my god. Did I make it? I made it. I made it to the top. Did I mention I'm out of shape? This is a little dangerous. It just keeps going. If I'm correct. Yes. I've reached Buckingham Avenue. And if directions tell me anything, I'm going this way. Okay, I think I'm ready. Oh man, check out that view. These people get that every day. Oh man. I made it, gang. I made it to Piggott'S castle. I never thought I'd see the day. I don't know if somebody actually lives in here. They talk about opening it up for, like, open houses every now and then, but look at this place. It's friggin' amazing. Oh, jeez. Look at this. And no worries, guys. I'm gonna give you the full story about this place when I get the chance to. Too tired to look it up right now, but wow. There's a cool staircase that leads up there. I mean, look at this place. It's amazing. Look at how cool this is. The police siren's ruining everything. Oh yeah, it's a little obstructed by the brush, but again, yeah, this is Piggott'S castle. It was built by Charles Piggott, who was a pretty prominent Portlander. I mean, you'd kind of have to be in order to have a home like this. I love this place. And see, it just kind of wraps around. Imagine living here. You've got this view of downtown in the distance. Yeah. You can even see there's pictures on the wall. I don't know how well. You can't really see them. You kind of see them a little bit. There's pictures on the wall. I wonder if one of those is Charles Piggott. Just look at the architecture. And from what I've read, Piggott himself only lived here for like a year or two. I think this is part of the home too. But yeah, so Charles Piggott was a prominent Portlander. He was a businessman. And he was also a writer. I mean, he was also an attorney. He was all over the place. He was a very strange guy, but very prominent, very well-to-do. And he had that house, that magnanimous castle built, and then he only lived in it for a short while. So I don't really know. And I honestly don't know where I'm going now. That was part of, like, when I came up here, I saw the castle, and then I turned around and went back home. So I honestly don't know where I'm going now. I don't know. But I wanted to just traverse these cutting back streets and just see a little bit more of Southwest Portland I've never seen. And start with Piggott's castle back there. Iconic landmark of Portland.
But he was resilient, and he knew what it was like to get through times of being broke. And he was still a man of prominence about town. By the fall of 1897, he started pursuing a career as an attorney. After being admitted to the bar, he briefly moved to a place called Sheep Camp, Alaska, before returning to Portland in the fall of 1898. Upon being settled back in the big city, he established a law practice with a partner, William Spencer Newberry. Newberry had served as Portland's 23rd mayor from 1877 to 1879, meaning he was the mayor of the city when Charles Piggott first moved there. They established their office in the Mulkey Building, located in downtown at 2nd and Morrison, demolished in 1953. Piggott would work as a practicing lawyer for many years, but it would not be the only realm he operated in. Piggott clearly also developed an increased interest in the real estate business as he gained a hold of many properties all over the Portland area, properties that frequently popped up for sale in local newspaper listings. In 1902, he briefly got into the brewery business, obtaining the Weiss Beer Brewing and Bottling Company with some partners. This brewery was said to be located at Milwaukee and Ellsworth, but I found no evidence in Ellsworth Street ever existed in Portland. But there is a Milwaukee and Ellis intersection, so maybe that's where it was. After just over a year, in 1903, Piggott was already trying to sell the place. In August 1907, he was leasing rooms at a hotel he owned, and by the early 1910s, it seemed every week he was trying to sell off another piece of property. By 1900, it appears Charles and his wife were at least separated. His census info states he was still married, while his wife, Sadie, is listed as being divorced. The two were not living together. Sadie was living with their children on what would today be Northeast 23rd and Oregon Street, where the charming Granada Court Apartments are today. Charles was listed as living at a 343 and a half Everett Street, which today would be right smack in the middle of where the historic Golden West Hotel stands today. This hotel opened in 1900, so perhaps Charles Piggott was just one of its earliest residents. By 1910, Piggott's address was listed as 142 and a half 2nd Avenue, which would place him at the southeast corner of Southwest 2nd and Alder Street. Come 1912, he also maintained another address, also on 2nd Avenue at 653 2nd, which today would be the southwest corner of 2nd and Arthur. Built in 1886, the beautiful home he would have stayed in is still around today. And we also know that by 1913, he was maintaining an address at Southwest 6th and Main, because in November of that year, a stumbling drunk named Frank Peters broke into his home and started throwing items at Piggott. Others in the home intervened, and Peters fled the scene only to be arrested a short while later. Another listing in the middle 1910s for selling a piece of property, interestingly enough a 2nd Avenue property, so perhaps one he'd previously lived at, lists him as living at 287 4th Street, which today would actually be right where the Wells Fargo Tower, tallest building in Oregon, is today. Before the 1910s were over, the now in his 60s Piggott would relocate to Oregon City. But we're not quite there yet. After about a decade working as a lawyer, Piggott's workplace was the same, at the Mulkey Building, but his partners had changed. By 1907, he was part of the firm of Piggott, Finch, and Bigger. The Finch in that title was a man named James Finch, a business associate and friend of Piggott's. On November 28, 1908, Finch walked into the office of another attorney, Ralph B. Fisher, in the Mohawk Building at 3rd and Morrison. After saying, "Hello, Ralph," Finch pulled a gun and shot Fisher twice in the head. Despite being witnessed by Fisher's personal stenographer, among others, After Finch was apprehended, he would play the delusional role of victim. Fisher happened to be the prosecutor of the grievance committee for the Oregon State Bar Association, and this same committee had recently disbarred Finch for a year, primarily for appearing drunk in court, as he developed a pretty serious drinking problem. But he also had been in trouble for forging the name of one of his partners, Charles Piggott. Despite Fisher's efforts to get him leniency, it appears Finch held him personally responsible for what he felt was an unjust punishment. After this shooting, it would come out that Ralph Fisher had been contacted at his office the day before by none other than Charles Piggott, who said the two men needed to meet up, but Fisher was busy and the meeting never happened. It's still unknown exactly why Piggott wanted to see him so desperately, but it's also known that the following day, only hours before the shooting, that Piggott had told Finch personally to stay away from Fisher. It seems clear Piggott knew Finch was unstable and a likely threat to the man that he would later kill. When Finch went on trial, Piggott was, understandably, part of his defense, but not his sole lawyer, as he admittedly noted he was not very experienced in criminal law. It didn't matter much, as come the start of 1909, Finch's whole defense team resigned, Piggott included. Finch and his wife would claim they did this solely because the Finches ran out of money to pay for a defense. They also claimed that Piggott told them to deed him everything they owned, or he would quit. Finch's wife even said Piggott told her to get rid of their kids and get a job to help pay for the defense. Piggott would deny this, of course, claiming he stepped down because he had too much going on and could not do Finch a proper justice. But it was a foregone conclusion either way that James Finch would be found guilty, and in November 1909, still pleading his innocence, he would be executed by hanging. Because apparently, in this little spot up here, I don't know, maybe Section 102 runs along this edge, and then this is Section 15. Because there's supposed to be a stone sticking out for Ralph B. Fisher, who was an attorney in the city of Portland. And the guy who killed him is also buried here. I couldn't find their graves, but they're buried a little ways downhill, just like one or two sections over. James Finch and his wife. Here's a big Scott one. Great Scott! Yeah, I'm not. Oh! Hello! Ask and you shall receive, unless this is a different Fisher family, but this is what his stone looks like. Yep, his grave is all covered in moss, but even you can make out Ralph B. Fisher. Died, I believe, 1908. Yep, that is an 8. Ralph B. Fisher, killed in his office by James Finch, who again, him and his wife are buried right downhill over there. And see, Bertha K. Fisher died in 1939. Obviously must have been his wife. And she had to handle that ordeal for a guy who literally got killed just for trying to help a friend out. Whether Charles Piggott was the vindictive sort or not, if he was trying to take control of Finch's goods, including their property, it would fit with his obvious interest in real estate ventures. And strangely, not long after leaving Finch, a woman he was defending in divorce proceedings, named Julia O'Connor, described him as follows after he tried to claim she was not mentally sound. She would say, "You are the biggest thief in Multnomah County. What I ought to do is to shoot you. You're a robber and a cutthroat lawyer. God pity one that gets into your clutches." She would also claim that Piggott had misled her into deeding away a bunch of her property, kind of like what the Finches said. This is perhaps, if it's true, the darker side of Mr. Piggott that hasn't been discussed very much. And while James Finch was struggling with his drinking, Charles Piggott had a little something else going on outside of work. 1908 would see Piggott publish a written work titled Pearls at Random Strung: Life's Tragedy from Wedding to Womb, the Scientific Causes of All Diseases, Poverty, Premature Death, and Longevity. Yes, that was the book's full title. And it's quite the read. I took this piece of work in during a yellow jacket-infested camping trip a few summers back. It really feels like the early 1900s example of those guys we see today in their mansions, surrounded by Lamborghinis, telling you how easy it's going to be for you to become the next millionaire. Piggott was a man who, even with the Panic of 1893, had lived a life of affluence since the end of the 1870s, letting everyone know how easy it should be to lead a better life. What I remember most about this book is eat lots of bananas. Seriously. The book is a combination of fair and logical observations intermingled with wild claims that Piggott clearly had no verification for. He talked a lot about health and cures for disease despite no background in medical science. It is still a fascinating read. I mean, I could go on forever about Pearls at Random Strung. In Piggott's own words, he wrote the book as a way to pay a debt to society by trying to show that life was not just a vast mistake. While bolstering people up one moment, he had lots of criticism for everyone the next. He criticized our ongoing reliance on people like preachers, doctors, and, ironically, lawyers. He described mankind at the time as a bald-headed, spectacled travesty on the image of his maker. He called out society for being full of lazy people that needed to be put to work and criticized society as being one wherein women were still slaves to men. Okay, that last part kind of made sense, but then he'd go on to advocate for the sterilization of our lesser people, and he recommended this as a useful method to get society back to love and clean living. Yeah, Piggott was kind of all over the place. I genuinely think he at least had a little bit of a screw loose, and I believe that beyond that which he wrote in his book, which it has been erroneously claimed was written inside the tower of his castle. As mentioned before the end of the 1910s, Piggott had relocated south to Oregon City, where he would remain for the remainder of his life. Because there was so much confusion about when he was born, when Charles Piggott finally passed away on July 7, 1924, there was a lot of confusion about how old he was. Find a Grave said he was 69 when he died, and even his own death certificate says that he was 73, even though they did not know his birth date. By Piggott's own account that he was born in August 1851, this means he was 72 years old when he passed away at Portland's St. Vincent Hospital. He had developed a case of gangrene that required the amputation of his right foot. Complications followed this, including aoritis, inflammation of the aorta, leading to acute dilatation of the heart, which would end up being the cause of his death. By the time of his death, he hadn't lived in his beloved castle home for over 30 years. Seeing as he managed to return to financial stability by the late 1890s, I wonder why Piggott never tried to get his castle back. He had opportunities, as the place had been vacant multiple times prior to his death. Perhaps losing it the first time was just too much. But even without its creator, this castle has stood the test of time, survived years of neglect and at least one fire to still stand as prominent and as beautiful as it ever has. Just about anyone who has walked through at least the southern portion of downtown or attended Portland State has seen this place, possibly multiple times, and it's still as engaging as it was when it was all by itself up in the hills. It's one of a limited few homes or even buildings in Portland that makes its viewer wonder, who built this and why? And even at the beginning, I didn't really know the answers to those questions. And it's the only castle home left in town. For those who don't know, there used to be another castle known as the Canterbury Castle in the West Hills. Completed in 1931, this stone home, a little ways west of Piggot's place, would be demolished in 2009 following efforts to renovate it. After Pigott left, back in 1893, the next person to live there was a local judge named Nat Bloomfield. The next known owner after that was a Portland lawyer named Joel N. Piercy, who bought the castle in 1903 and lived there until 1907. The tower by then was primarily used by his children as a play area, and even by then, it was described as having sustained a good deal of water damage from periods of neglect in vacancy. After the Piercys left in 1907, the castle lingered vacant again. During these periods of vacancy, it would frequently be vandalized by local kids. It developed a reputation as a haunted castle for a multitude of reasons. It was falling into disrepair with stains all over the brick, overgrowth of nearby plant life, and broken windows. It's also important to remember that the castle was up on that hill, above town, all by itself. It had that standard look, the house on Haunted Hill, Norman Bates's home lingering above the motel. The castle was destined to have a haunted reputation, even though practically no one went there or had any valid stories of paranormal activity going on there. Despite its shoddy reputation, with some even at this time calling for the place to be torn down, due to its location, the castle was an impossible-to-miss landmark. As I went through several old pictures capturing the downtown Portland area and its surroundings, the castle almost always made sure to pop up somewhere. It was always there, even when barely visible, it was still there, watching over the city. Even maps and diagrams of the Portland area often included Piggott's castle somewhere. It was such a gripping location, and yet it was often left without tenants. But why? What local wouldn't want such a place to live? Beyond the castle vibes itself, it had one of the best views one could ask for, capturing a full view of downtown and beyond, out east and to Mount St. Helens off in the north. It was a popular place to take photographs from, and when an architect named Edward H. Bennett was brought in 1912 to create a plan to change the world of Portland, an outline of the city was drawn and presented from the grounds that Piggott's castle was located on. So why was it vacant so often? More than anything, at the time with the castle up there alone, it was a very difficult place to reach. Pigott himself described this as a primary reason the home was often vacant. One had to climb through the brush uphill to get there. Pigott had hoped a streetcar would pass through that area someday, which would make the property much easier to reach. This never quite happened, even though a streetcar line was built running up to Council Crest, wherein it climbed the hill near Montgomery Street, just a short distance west of Piggott's home. The castle was just not a practical place to live at, and even as late as 1920, it was mainly accessible only through a walking trail. Pigott himself also addressed the numerous claims of his castle being haunted in a 1920 article wherein he was quoted to say, "While I lived in the house, there was never a hint of a spirit. I'm sure of that. But I'm not so sure of what came afterward." He would also say, "I believe my spirit guardians are making the house their own." He made this statement in relation to claims that people didn't go there as the spirits there were keeping intruders away from the castle on behalf of its creator. This also made sense for Pigott, as he definitely had an interest in mysticism, the paranormal, and the unknown. In 1910, he was listed as the president of the Ministers and Mediums Spiritualistic Association, and in a 1908 article I found, noted that he would be giving a lecture for a spiritualist society at the Abington building that once stood on 3rd Avenue between Washington and Stark. Just another little ripple in the personality of this castle man. The next known resident in the castle relocated there in 1910. Born in 1850 in Piggott'S native Canada, Theodore Jejou would come to great prominence as an artist and painter in America. He traveled the country but was best known in New York. While in Cleveland, Ohio in December 1909, he suddenly dropped from sight. He'd contacted no one, not even his immediate family. As the days passed, concerns arose that he may have met with foul play. He would be missing, so to speak, for almost 2 years before he was rediscovered, alive. Any guesses as to where he was during this time? In December 1911, Jejou was seen in Portland by someone who knew him, and his sighting was reported back home to his family, and he was reported still alive and well. He had moved into the old Glebe Castle while he stayed busy at work, mainly doing portraits of prominent local citizens. Reportedly, the castle's reputation as a falling-apart haunted house had attracted his intrigue, and despite this, he flourished in his work while up there alone on the hill. While there, however, he sought to make sense of all these haunted claims. The strongest of these were claims of sounds of feet shuffling on the castle stairs, the rattling of doors, and the sounds of disembodied voices. Getting used to life up on the hill, Jejou discovered for himself that there were simple answers to these questions. In relation to the footsteps on the stairs, he referenced the massive Albina rail yards to the north and across the Willamette River. He said that when the train horns went off in those yards, and the wind carried the sounds just right, it would enter through the windows and rattle through the home, giving off a sound similar to footsteps. In terms of the doors rattling, he noted that with the elevation of the house, it caught the winds sweeping through the West Hills, with limited trees and no other houses to block it from the windows. When these strong winds blew inside, it made the doors rattle. And finally, in relation to the sounds of voices heard inside the castle, another oddity of Piggott's creation was a tube that he ran down to the base of the castle so that when someone was outside at ground level, they could speak through it to someone on a higher floor. Kind of a rudimentary intercom system. In essence, whenever someone passed near this tube while talking, their voices could be picked up, and it would echo up into the building. It was known local kids would play pranks that included talking through the tube to try and make those inside think a ghost was talking to them. It seemed Jejou had debunked all of the haunted concerns, and all in all, he loved his experience working out of that old castle. But still, by the end of 1911, his whereabouts were unveiled, and he left the castle a short while later. By 1920, the castle was listed under the ownership of a man who worked in the lumber industry named C.W. Embody. It's unknown exactly how long he owned it and or lived there. But during this same year, there was a funny little blip in a local paper, one of the kinds of oddball articles I've come to expect from older newspapers. In it, the newspaper itself is apologizing to the castle itself, as a headline in a recent article stated the place was being used for a moonshine operation, when said operation existed just near the castle. It made sense. Up in those empty forested hills, what better place to run off some moonshine? In a piece written about a John Deering family who came to America from Russia in the 1910s, published on the Volga Germans in Portland site, a great spot to find some, I personally feel, underappreciated history, it notes that they had rented the castle just before 1921. My guess is then that they rented it from Embody, but either way, it notes that they lived there till around 1924, when an economic decline forced them to relocate to California. One of his children wrote, "I spent my first 3 years of life in this castle and vividly remember, among other things, our abode and scenes of the Portland landscape from the castle's turrets." By the 1930s, the castle had experienced another lengthy period of vacancy, experiencing further random acts of vandalism in the process. But it was about to get the facelift that it needed. In 1934, a citizens organization called Everyman's Castle Incorporated gathered up thousands of dollars to clean up and revive the old castle before converting it into an apartment building. This work would be the first of multiple instances wherein the interior of the castle would be altered. Over time, walls within would be taken down as some rooms were deemed to be just way too small. It's unknown exactly how long the castle functioned as an apartment house, but in an interesting turn of events, come 1945, the castle home was purchased by a Gordon Atlee Piercy, the grandson of Joel Piercy, who'd owned it some 40 years earlier. In an article published in 1962, Gordon discussed how his daughter had loved living there, but he stated it in present tense, suggesting that even by 1962, they were still living there. All these many years, the charm of the castle as a haunted house on the hill had faded, and it had transitioned more to a place of intrigue for its unique appearance. In 1969, the castle was gutted by a fire, causing extensive interior damage, but fortunately no structural damage. Despite being in rough shape and in need of further renovation, in 1970 the castle was designated by the Portland City Council as a historical landmark. And at this time, the property was listed as belonging to an Alice Piercy, the wife of Gordon. Come 1971, a local philanthropist, Jack Litgarn, stepped up, making a commitment to try and save the castle and revive it with the hopes of converting it into a museum of some kind. While the museum idea never became a reality, a $100,000 renovation project did take place, once again reviving the now 80-year-old castle. While it's completely unrelated, something else interesting happened in 1971. A wedding announcement was posted in a newspaper for the planned marriage between an Anne Marie Castle and a Terence M. Pigott. A Pigott Castle wedding. Anyway, according to 1981 documentation, at some point Litgarn had taken ownership of the castle. But come 1981, it was listed as belonging to a John and Kelly Grout. Pictures of the castle around this time show boarded up windows and no trespassing signs in the windows, showing it was vacant once again around this time. But this didn't prevent the castle from being added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1979. It also appears the Grouts have maintained ownership of the castle for quite some time, as mortgage records show John Grout taking out loans as late as 2019, while a Roger Daly is listed as having purchased the home way back in 2003. Recently, the castle has appeared on the market again, so if you've got $1.5 million burning a hole in your pocket, here's something to spend it on. Just don't trust any of those real estate websites, which for some reason or another all think Pigott's castle was built in 1894.